with or without the commissioners. Okay, we're going to continue with the agenda. And the next portion is our SPO update, which will be provided by one of our SPO members, Mr. Dean Gialamas. So I'm going to turn it over to Gene. Dean, slides should be coming up here soon, Dean.
Sure. Well, thank you, Nelson. Either everyone didn't want to hear me speak or everyone's really enjoying their break. So for those that are back, thank you. I'm going to go through I'm going to hold on to see if the slides come up because
something went to sleep. The projector may have gone to sleep, but it's showing up there. But the slides are up on my computer. It's just not showing. All right. Let's see. I don't know. This looks. We're not allowed to take breaks anymore, I tell you. Something went to sleep here that we don't know about yet.
Kind of really need the slides in order to show the changes we made. Otherwise, I'd tell you to go ahead, Dean, but.
just trust me. Thank you very much.
Very well. Next topic.
We have this problem at High Tech U also.
Did anything change on this? It's on laptop too.
If you'll notice, we never have these problems at DOJ.
That was Jerry Laporte, by the way. Just to be clear. Well, we do have the e-binder, though, right? Well, we do have the e-binder. Maybe we can follow through that. Yeah, let's do that, Dean. Why don't we start? If everybody has their e-binder up and running, we'll go that route.
All right, well, I'm going to start with slide number 2, which you can't see, but is on your screen, hopefully. Just 4 topics for update, just to give everybody an idea of some of the bylaws considerations that we talked about on the Standards and Procedures Operating Subcommittee. A note that will be discussed and included for views and recommendations, and a footnote that goes along with that, and then we will talk about some of the proposals that have come forward for the next 2 meetings for discussion to include for us. Regarding the bylaws, there was a discussion last time about including some language that was going to be recommended to be added, and there was a lot of discussion by the Commission about that language. That language was to include, quote, when work products are adopted by the Commission, technical and conforming authority will be granted to Commission staff. There was a lot of concern about the variability of the rights, if you will, of staff and the subcommittee to make changes to the recommendations and the views documents that were being put forward. And there was some question about the terminology of technical and conforming authority. So based on a bylaws review and based on a couple of our work group meetings, we decided that the very simple thing is that we're not going to add that language, so that will be removed. There's no need to include it. And that there already is some language in the bylaws that allow for non-substantive changes to be made to documents for the purposes of just procedurally moving them forward. So the convention that the SPO is recommending and will be moving forward with will be that if there's a non-substantive revision or a minor edit to a document, it will go to the co-chairs of that subcommittee just to make sure and ensure that the spirit of those changes has not affected the document based on the intent, and that any reconciled document that has any changes that would be deemed somewhat substantial would actually come back to the commission for review and vote if necessary. So that way we just ensure the process moves forward. We're not bogged down with bringing bureaucracy to the commission level, but at the same time, anything that's significant, we will bring back to the commission for review so that there's an assurance that nothing is moving or being changed in a document inappropriately. There was also a recommendation for a quote tripwire recommendation. This is slide 4 now. And that recommendation was something that we discussed and considered over a couple of our conference calls. We, however, found that it was going to be very difficult to formalize the process. We felt that what we just talked about, the idea of non-substantive versus substantive changes, would include that, and that we would include any revision or amendments on the document itself, just like typical document control. So although it was a good recommendation, we decided that we weren't going to move forward with the tripwire concept just because it was so difficult to formalize in our process moving forward. Moving on to slide 5, in your notebook there's a views and recommendation note that will be added. This is just an administrative piece, and slides 6 and 7 represent what those are. So on views documents, the green language that's on the slide will be what's added, and basically it's adding 2 sentences. One is indicating that the portion of the document directly labeled views of the commission represent the formal views of the commission, and then information beyond that section is provided for context. Very similar to what we have discussed in the past about making sure that the discussion of the document doesn't become the argumentative piece of the document, that we're focused on what really the core business is, and that's the view and recommendation. There's also another sentence that's been added just indicating that the National Commission is a federal advisory committee established by the Department of Justice, and folks can seek additional information, just clarifying our role with the Attorney General. On a recommendation document, the same note is going to be added. So we have a note for views, and we have the same note basically for recommendations. And it's adding the language, the same sentences that I just read you, but in addition to that, it's just that the National Commission is proposing acts, specific acts that the Attorney General could take to further the goals of the Commission. So it's just, again, just outlining what the recommendation is. When we get to slides 8 and 9, all this is really doing is just formalizing this process by including that note in our work development process. So this is kind of going in as a supplement to the document, indicating that when we produce documents, that language will be in our either recommendations or our view. That's simply all that that's saying. I'm going to stop there. That's really the summary of what we did on the committee. Before I move forward to proposals for the next meetings, are there any concerns, thoughts, or questions? Okay. Julia?
So this is a question that was raised about the views document, the note addition. Am I on the right page here?
Yes.
Okay, so that the sentence that was already in there, this document does not formally recommend any action by a government entity, and thus no further action will be taken upon its approval by the commission. So in several of the subcommittees, talking to other people, they found that problematic. Is this the time to raise that issue?
Well, I suppose it could be, but that wasn't an area of the document we were editing based on our last discussion. So that would be a new item. And I suppose if it was a new item, it could be brought up for us to consider, but it wasn't part of the work that we just did based on what we're reporting on our activity. Julia, do you have something to
Yeah, if I could add to that, I guess then I would ask that, that you take a look at it, and I apologize for not having thought more carefully about this language that was being put on there, but it seems to me that it's not intentional, but it makes it the sort of, it's very dismissive of the views documents. And when I think about the kind of work we're putting into them, the kind of leadership we'd like to show through them, the statement of here's our view, but you don't have to do anything about it. Nobody has to do anything about it. It may not be what it means. I know what we're trying to say, that I mean, really what happened was we were producing views documents and the Attorney General said, I'm not going to act on them. If you want me to act, call it a recommendation. And so we've changed how we do things, but I don't think that that takes away from what we thought the import of the views documents we were producing. And so whether it ends up being I'd ask you to take under consideration whether it ends up being a statement that this document does not formally recommend a specific action or actions by a specific government entity, and is instead a view that any entity that engages in forensic science or uses forensic science should consider when developing policies or procedures, or something like that. We're asking people to take this into consideration. Otherwise, we should stop doing views documents.
Sure, and I think the intent for that language originally was directed toward the Attorney General, and I think your view is directing it to the community at large, so I think that's a valuable point. If you would do me a favor and just send that to me or share it with me later, then we can certainly add that to our discussion for one of our next committee meetings. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, Bill.
Yeah, Dean, the sentence just discussed was also a topic of discussion during the Human Factors Subcommittee meeting, and I think the sense of the Human Factors Subcommittee is consistent with what Julia said. I mean, the sentence as written has some serious problems. I mean, the first part of the sentence, this document does not formally recommend any action by a government entity. That's simply not true. If you look at the views documents that have been approved so far, the great majority of them recommend that some government entity do something, right? And so the first part's untrue. The second part of the sentence, no further action will be taken upon or on its approval by the Commission, I think that's something we all sincerely hope is untrue. Right? We certainly hope that as the result of promulgating these views documents suggesting that some governmental entity, whether it be a lab or something, that we hope that something will happen. And so I would recommend, in fact, I would even move if it's appropriate to do so, that the sentence in question simply be removed. I don't think it's, I don't know what the purpose was, but clearly the way it's written is not achieving whatever purpose was intended. And so I think you should take it out and substitute something else if appropriate.
Sure, we will take it on advisement. I do want to note, though, that there was a distinction between a formal recommendation and a view. We had a lot of discussion on this commission about that, and if we simply remove that, I think we're removing a lot of discussion we had about the spirit of why we had a views document and a recommendation document. I hear what you're saying, Bill, and I think we need to try to probably massage that language a little bit so that we're not misrepresenting what the intent is with a views document.
Yeah, I think recommendations documents are recommendations that the Attorney General do something, whereas views documents often reflect the view that some other entity, such as laboratories, OSAC. I mean, I looked through what are the funding, federal funding agencies, et cetera. So there are a number of views expressed that suggest that some government entity should do something, whether it be provide more funding for certain kinds of research, look into something, change procedures, et cetera. So I think the way you'd separate it is to say something like, this is not a recommendation to the Attorney General to take any action, and no further action will be taken by the Attorney General. If you simply said that, then I think it would clarify your intent, and that would remove the unfortunate wording that seems to imply something else.
Sure, sure.
Actually, I wouldn't even say that no further action will be taken by the Attorney General. I mean, presumably, if the view is a good one, then maybe some action will. We're just not dictating what that action should be when we write the document.
Yeah, all right,
So
fair enough.
I mean, I think what we're saying when we do this is that we're saying again, we think that people engaged in forensic science or using forensic science ought to consider these views, whatever they are, when they do whatever they're doing with forensic science.
And I hear that sentiment that even though it's a views document, we still are encouraging some action to be taken, otherwise we wouldn't have that view to present. So we'll take that spirit back, we'll come up with some language and have something for everyone to digest next time. Just for clarity purposes though, for me, I'm assuming that since that was a new item that Paul brought up and a few others, the language that is in green is not the controversial piece at this point, it's just the other language that was already there that we'll revisit, so, okay. Thank you for that clarity.
Dean, if I can add, I mean, we 2 meetings left, and we're still working on trying to see our procedures. I'm looking at that, and I don't have a problem with eliminating it. I don't know, but I know the SPO, let's just, unless there's some major controversy, it clearly says that it's a view of the National Commission. It doesn't represent DOJ or NIST. It goes on to speak, so taking that out and people agree on the green aspects, I would say let's do it. Because I don't know what's going to happen in
I would agree
January.
with you, Nelson. I see no harm in taking that
Right,
just that whole
so
sentence out.
unless there's a major, we can do a business vote
Certainly the second half is inappropriate.
so we can move on. Because I don't want to address this again next meeting. Okay, let's just show of hands. If we eliminate that, is everybody okay with the language in there? Passes. We don't need John's clickers. Thank you, Dean.
Well, with that, I get to turn the mic back over to you, Nelson, because we're going to talk about the proposal for the next couple of meetings.
Okay, thank you. So, you know, there's been a lot of talk about winding down and what are we going to do and how we move forward. And I just want to quickly review. I had some slides, but I'll do my best because these aren't in your e-binder. Is it up there? What's that?
You want the other ones?
I didn't write that. You wrote that? Okay, anyhow. So one of the things that we discussed at meeting 9 was that we had former meetings and that the Attorney General has 2 meetings theoretically to provide an opinion on a recommendation. So any recommendation that we give today, theoretically, by April, you'll be able to get some feedback on. Anything that comes out of a recommendation, like for example, I think there's 2 that we're actually voting on, are in public comment. I don't know what's going to happen to those recommendations. So I just want to discuss those issues because meeting 13 is April 10 through the 11th. That is certainly a new administration, regardless of what party. And we don't know what the climate is going to be with them moving forward. You heard Willie May talk about a January departure, so in the April meeting, it'll be a new director of NIST as well. So I think we need to start thinking about how we can kind of tie up all the work that we've done. And although we have all these documents out there, I can wait. Although we have all these documents out there, I think it would be nice, and we discussed this with the SPO, to have a summary document, something to kind of say, here's the first 2 terms of this commission, here's what we did, kind of organize it nicely, provide, and then add the unfinished business part toward the end of that, and here are the areas that we think. So I'm proposing, can you put the next slide up? Oh, okay. Oh, thank you. I got it. So just to review, so we have these 4 recommendations that are for final vote today. OLP may get on it and be able to get back to you in January, but it's going to be kind of tough with everything else they're doing. So this is why I'm bringing this to your attention. So the 4 that we're voting on today, I don't know what the status is going to be for April, and I'm just talking reality here. We have 5 for views for final vote. Now that we cleared up the views wording, those are fine to go. We have 3 views introduced. Again, I'm not worried about those because we can vote on those next time and they'll serve us well. And then we have 2 recommendations that will likely not get AG action. Those are my words. I have not discussed with anyone. I'm just saying, just on timing on how things are worked out. So what I'm recommending is that we don't have any more documents and that we spend our time for the next 2 meetings discussing the panels that we could have inform the commission on unfinished business and begin drafting and putting together this summary document. If there's a views document that some subcommittee feels very strongly about, then let's discuss that and we'll move forward. This is just what I'm recommending. I'd like to see us have a strong document that we can pass on either to the next commission or to whatever body wants to see what we did and what remains to be done. And we can use the structure we have, we can break it down into various sections so we can put something nice together. So that's what I'm recommending, which really would take the subcommittees in a different direction, but I think it would be the best use of our time. Honestly, we're probably looking at January as the most productive ending meeting, and I don't know what's going to happen in April in terms of what's going to be, what can happen. Well, we can always meet and we can deliver this document, but we're delivering it almost as a view of the commission then at the end of summary report. So we can discuss this in more detail at the wrap-up, but I did want to use this time to begin this process because we did send out some potential panel discussions for the next 2 meetings, and we're really open to whatever the commission wants to do in terms of panels, in terms of documents. So I wanted to throw this out now because I think this is the best way of handling it. If the next administration decides that this commission, as it currently is structured, is going to continue, we just start right where we left off and move on. But I don't want subcommittees to be working, I hate to say it, without no action at the end. And then they just have this document that sits there and spend a lot of work. So I think we've reached a point where the subcommittee has done what they can do, and we should focus on some other summary document. Yes, Judge?
So this is, I hope, not inconsistent with what you just said, but the Reporting and Testimony Subcommittee, which has a views document that's coming up tomorrow on statistical statements, but at our meeting this morning, we decided that we wanted to make some material changes in that document, partly based on comments that have been received, partly based on what we think will be comments coming from the panel tomorrow and from the commission itself. So our plan had been to then have a rewritten views documents on statistical significance put out again for public comment, since it would be changed sufficiently or substantially from what's there is now, and then have it come up for a final vote at the last meeting in April. So
And as a views document, that would work.
okay.
Because we control the views document, so we can vote on it in April. I don't think it's wise to have a totally new document that hasn't gone out there. Now, that doesn't mean if there's a views document that a subcommittee has had on the docket there and we just haven't gotten to it, please, let's bring that up. Again, in the wrap-up, I think we're going to have more of a discussion about a path forward. I'd just like to see our energy put together in a nice summary document in some format that's organized, well-written, so it's not just so many documents that are sitting out there. You follow me? You can point to them. I think that would be an elegant way to kind of sunset our term and then let the new term do what it needs to do, if there is a new term. Oh, Stephen, I'm sorry.
Between now and January, I think with probability essentially 1, we will actually see the PCAST report. There was some probability it might have appeared before today, but that has gone to 0. I think that there are a number of items that will appear there that would be worthy of at least some discussion in this forum and possibly incorporation into the agenda going forward if they're not already there. And I would hope that that could be done.
Yes, I think one of the things in anticipation of the PCAST report being issued, we were considering having a discussion, a panel on that particular issue, which then we can decide on how we take that information and put it in this unfinished business. Now, I will say that some of you did provide us some feedback on the unfinished business, which is what you saw. And again, I think we need to continue to have that, so we just don't have a list, so we have kind of a well-thought-out idea of what are the things that we think we need to get done, again, as part of this summary document. Marilyn?
I think that doing the summary report is really key to show the progress and to show how everything fits together. So I'm totally in support of that. But I also thought some of the ideas for the panels were great, and there's no reason we couldn't have, our working time be part panel that might actually go into that summary report. And I really support the PCAST being one of the things we talk about.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the idea. That's why we sent out a list of panels, so we can discuss
Up
that.
on the screen.
Yeah, that one. Can't see it here. So, yeah, and I think it would be helpful to have the panels inform our unfinished business so we can maybe put some context about why we think it's important. But that's up to you. Yeah, my idea was that we have very little subcommittee time, more time discussing the summary report and panels. That's how the format of the next two meetings. Now, if there's some pending views document, as the judge referred to, or some voting that we need to do to finish up some other ones, absolutely, we'll do that. But that's kind of the plan that I was thinking moving forward. I wasn't on your SPO meeting, but I believe that you folks kind of agreed on the summary document to some extent. So I think Julia was up next, Pam, I think. That's okay. Go ahead, Pam.
One thing that's not on the list, and maybe I just haven't read the agendas correctly of whether or not we've been set up to engage on this. While we're engaging with DOJ on this review, or how they're going to do the study review, we haven't had a real opportunity to engage on the uniform language for testimony and reporting. And I think that's the fact of the publication of those drafts is an important event. And it seems to me it's something that we ought to weigh in on, and I'll give away some of my view on this, because in no small part, I think asking us to do it on regulations.gov as sort of a crowdsourced way of looking at something is not appropriate for what the topic is, and that it's something that we should engage on, both on the process of producing them and on what has actually been produced.
Tomorrow afternoon, we are going to have a chance to hear on the OLP, the Forensic Science Discipline Review.
Yeah, I know
that'll
they've
be
already
tomorrow,
engaging
yes.
with us on the
Right.
review, but I'm talking about what
Ultras, yeah.
The old.
the ultra, is that what they? And I don't think we've really engaged with DOJ on that, and I think those are.
What I think we should do, and we were kind of short on time, but in the wrap-up, or if we've got any time, is begin discussing these issues that we want to bring up, whether it be the ultras and you want some feedback, and as a commission talk about this unfinished business. And think about what a summary report can look like as well. I don't think, 190, 200 page report is what we're looking for. I think we're looking for something that just kind of coalesces everything. Go ahead, Pam.
So just to catch Nelson up a little bit too, I think this is a really important idea. We had this discussion in the SPO subcommittee. I, at that meeting, volunteered to draft or begin drafting. I can't promise well-written. I can promise at least drafted and organized. But I did commit to doing that, at least to do sort of a summary of what we've done and begin to identify and really be at least someone to take on at least all or a part of the responsibility of doing that for the group, because I do really think that it's important. So the other thing we talked about, just to highlight something I don't think has been said yet, is just that at least within that group we were talking about what this could look like as being something that's not going out for public comment and that kind of thing, but a business record. So it's coming specifically from not only those of us that sit on this commission as voting members, but of the entire commission, including everybody that's at this table, so that it's something that really is a business record generated from the commission. So we have had some of those logistical discussions. We'd love to hear later about what other ideas people have, but I did want to just to reiterate that that was discussed in that call.
Thank you. Jerry?
So Nelson, obviously I think it's very important to put together a good summary. I think we have a lot of that on the website, and there's lots of documents to do that with. But I think more importantly, sort of a going forward and if this commission sort of all agrees with each other, I think we need to put together a sales pitch for the next administration to say why this should continue and sort of what's unfinished business and what this commission can do to address that unfinished business. So, like any business plan, you can talk about what you did that was great, and most people really don't care. They want to know what's going forward. So I think if you put together a nice didactic approach of this is what we've done, this is what we have unfinished, and this is what we'd like to do, and we kind of pitch that to the next administration.
This is sort of the dialogue I think we need to have, yeah? Decide what we want. Well, Judge.
I guess I want to perhaps be a little bit of a voice of dissent on preparing our funeral. I don't object to a comprehensive pitch document. I think that makes a lot of sense. But I'm not ready to, it feels, it's September. It feels a little early for us to put the brakes on the good work that we're doing. And this is coming from a subcommittee that does not even have another thing in the works. So this is not me trying to, we'll come up with something really good, don't get me wrong. But we don't have something right now that I'm worried about. So it's more, I'm proud of what this commission has done altogether, and it feels a little early for me to start thinking about sunsetting. And I believe part of a good pitch for the next administration, and I thoroughly concede that some of you probably know more than I do about whether a Clinton administration would be interested in continuing this work, but a good pitch would make a difference. A Trump administration, I don't believe any of you know what a Trump administration wants to do, because I'm not sure anybody does. But I think a good pitch is good for anybody. But there's even, I haven't done my ad law homework, but this president feels incredibly strongly about this work. And can you renew a charter in January, even though it doesn't expire till April? Has anyone done that homework yet? I'm just saying there's a lot of ways in which this work might continue. And so I feel like it's a little bit early for us to put the brakes on and just talk about a summary document, which Pam's already said she's going to do. So frees up the rest of us to do other things.
It's not putting a stop to the work. I'm just trying, it's like a realistic approach of what we have. I think we can spend our energy putting more documents out, certainly, where the current Attorney General will not have an opportunity to respond to. So we looked at it, and again, I wasn't at the SPO meeting. Like I said, if there's views documents that you want to put out, certainly.
But even if she doesn't respond to them, and they're part of the pitch for why the next administration should continue the work, I don't know.
Right, but the energy in making that case, rather than spending it in subcommittee, why not spend it discussing what we can do to sell it? In other words, here's the unfinished business. Look, and there's different ways of skinning the cat. I'm open. I'm just bringing it to your attention. I'd like to see, personally, I think there's a lot of work that went into it. I don't think the documents are organized in a way that anybody can pick them up and say, oh, I see what they're doing. They're just organized by title.
Pam,
it'd be nice
on that.
It'd be nice to have them in some sort of organized approach to say, here are the areas that we looked at, here's what we did, and here are the areas that we still think need to be examined, and we believe whatever we want. So
I just think with all this talent around this table, we can be more ambitious than that. That's my only message.
that's pretty ambitious as far as, putting that document together is pretty ambitious. But listen, we're open for discussion. What I would propose is that we kind of go on to the subcommittee reporting, come back to this in the wrap-up during your free time, talk about it, and then we'll discuss it again. I'm just proposing a path forward, looking at the realistic aspects of what could happen, and the fact that this administration has said that they aren't going to act on it until the next administration. So that's all. That's all. Okay, let's move on. Who's next here? Accreditation and proficiency testing. Ladies, are you ready? Obviously, we're having technical difficulties.
Which document do you want up first? We'll have all the documents only on here, unfortunately, not down in.
Right. I think the proficiency testing recommendation.
Which
Yeah.
is page 16.
We'll try and go in order.
It's page 16 on the PDF, if anyone's looking.
Yes, page 16 on the e-binder, or page 18 if you want to see the redlined version. So we have 4 documents that are up for a final vote. One is a recommendation, and the other 3 are views documents. So all of those have already been out for public comment. We have adjudicated those comments, and the adjudication documents were included in the e-binder. And we'll go through just briefly a few of the changes, but don't want to belabor since we have plenty of other things to talk about, it seems like. So with the proficiency testing document, we did address the few comments that we had. We tried to make it clear that the 3 years that was recommended in the proficiency testing recommendation was not that someone should have to take a proficiency test every 3 years, but if you're not already participating in a proficiency testing program, that you should begin doing so within a 3-year period. And also, we just changed some of the language in the recommendation to encourage all forensic science practitioners outside of DOJ. We changed some of that language to be a little less, a little more carrot-like and a little less stick-like, as the manner in which it was presented. And really, those are the only major changes that were made. Does anybody have any questions about any of those changes? If not, I would see if John,
What do you want to do? You want to go up for a vote?
I think we might as well go ahead and vote.
Move for a vote.
Sorry, this actually can't be the show of hands. It has to be the clickers.
No. I have to establish a quorum first, just a second.
Oh, okay.
So I just wanted to go through who we have here for voting. Where did it just go? There it is, okay. So we have, the ex officios will not vote on this. But so the voting members that are not here, Jules, he has a proxy with Bill Thompson. Phil Pulaski has provided votes. Vince DeMaio has provided votes, and John Futenberg has provided votes. Yes? And so John McGrath has the clickers for those. And so we'll need to have 22 votes to get 2/3. Okay, so the first one up is the recommendation on proficiency testing. Yes, no, or abstain. The other person that left was Mark LeBeau, and he gave me his clicker and his vote, so I have that as well. Because we're at 32 of 40, so, and that should be everybody because we don't have the other 8. So we have 97% yes, 3% no, so this passes. Okay?
All right.
John, just for the record, does that vote include the non-present members as well? That 97%?
Yes. So all 32 clickers that were assigned to somebody have been clicked because John McGrath has the votes from everybody, so he's putting in their votes. So, yep. Okay, next document you want up?
The views document on accreditation program requirements.
Which page? Do you want to do it off of the PDF?
Sure, it's the clean will be page 22 in the PDF, track changes in page 25, and if you wanted to see the specifics of the adjudication, that's on page 28.
We can pull up all based on what people want, so I have them all here.
Just
so.
go to, you might want to go to the 25, the track changes, so people can see. Move down. So we had actually four different commenters on this. We addressed every specific comment that was made from each of the four in the adjudication document, lining out exactly what was said and then how we responded. One of them did call for to make this a directive recommendation, and we did explain that we didn't feel that that was appropriate for the nature of what we were discussing here or the action there, because there was really no action that could be asked of the Attorney General in terms of this, for what this is talking about. We did some were grammatical, and there were many others that I think in terms talked about the language was very confusing. It needed clarification. What were you really talking about? Some of the comments also recommended the fact that we were asking things sometimes of the accrediting bodies, sometimes of maybe what a forensic science service provider might do, or what standards might be set for the forensic science service providers to meet. So we did some clarification. There was also an ask for some additional background on why did we even have this? Why are we putting this document forward? So we did add an entire paragraph section into the background area talking about the variation that currently exists, and just giving a few limited examples between the accrediting bodies, all that are accrediting to 17025, but just how even those standards you can get and have variation. And then we did go through on each of the specific bullets that we had talked about under the views section, and we clarified the language. We made sure we were being specific about when we talked about assessments versus surveillance visits, using the correct accreditation language. And we also separated out what specifically we would ask of the accrediting bodies versus what would be changes to standards that the forensic science service providers would meet. The other thing we didn't do, which was also asked, was why aren't you recommending specific things? Why aren't you saying how many times? Why aren't you saying how many times you should do this, how often these things? And that really wasn't the goal. The idea of this document was to recognize the good practices that already exist in accreditation of forensic science service providers, and just recommend that those be built upon. Understanding that there are going to be costs associated with all of this, but that it was not to criticize what had currently existed or to specify a certain amount going forward, but instead to build upon existing good practices. And so that is in some of the adjudication document that we answered that. So we did have one other recommendation that came and said that we should also be considering whenever changes are being made for accreditation standards, that it should look to other sources. It should look to things such as what is being produced by the OSAC or by other organizations out there. So we did add a specific reference to that into the document. And so that is basically, I don't know if we have any questions on this or other comments. Okay, Peter?
On the additions, it says, these sampling plans should include targeted and random sampling of case records. Now, when you use the term random sampling of case records, when we use that term with the Joint Commission, when there's a hospital accreditation, that means that the inspectors go there and all of a sudden they say, we want everything from the first week in January 1995. Is that what you mean by that? I mean, meaning that the lab doesn't know in advance which records can be requested and it's just done by the inspectors?
So that exists now in the laboratory accreditation, but we want to put that language in there because it may or may not always be done. But yes, that's exactly, that there will be specific ones, but also they could randomly ask for others. Anyone else I'm missing and can't see? Okay, then I guess I would, Linda, did you?
That's okay.
You sure? Mm-hmm. I guess we'll call for a vote on this one.
So moved.
Second.
For the views document, accreditation program requirements, correct?
Yes.
Is the right one up? Okay. Yes, no, or abstain? So we're looking for two more to get 32. Did you click all of yours? All right, still missing one, but we'll. click one more time with all your clickers. We tested them all yeses worked and all nos worked earlier today, so. But then the projector worked fine earlier today, too. So. Okay, so that gives us 90% yes, 10% no. And we'll go back and figure out who the missing person is and identify that later. Okay, so that passes.
All right, the next two documents are related to certification, and Cecilia Kraus is going to present those two.
On page 42, track changes, the first thing you'll notice is that we eliminated in the title and recognition of it. It became very confusing as to who was being recognized, so we decided not to recognize the recognition and got rid of it. So we had 5 comments on this particular document, and this is, the document, of course, is about forensic science certification bodies becoming accredited. And all of the comments, both for this and the second one, were extremely thoughtful and helpful. ASCLD Lab Board of Directors submitted some concerns, and they were pretty much the same as the Association of State Criminal Investigative Agencies. They had the same concerns, and it was specifically about anything from compensation and benefits and hiring practices and employment contingencies. And we have an Appendix D, which they applauded because that particular appendix does cover all the considerations for the certifying bodies. We did add one more thing to that, but I'll tell you about that when we get to the certification of practitioners. So all of the comments were adjudicated. I'm very, very grateful for the number of people, especially AFTI, that responded to differences in Appendix A. Appendix A was originally written in 2010 with the IWIG, and some things had changed, and we thought we had gotten them all and reached out to everyone, and, well, silly us. There were some things that really needed to be clarified and changed. So we did all of those, regardless of who the commenter was. And Ted had some formatting concerns, which we changed every one, and some clarification of some sentences that specifically on page 3 there was a sentence that had to do with implementing new policies and procedures, and that didn't seem to be, in his words, they were a bit cryptic. And when we read it, we said, yes, this is a bit cryptic. So we actually added a new sentence that we hope is non-cryptic that has to do with a forensic science service provider may also be impacted, and that policies and procedures must be written to address certification program. These may include the addition of a certification statement in job descriptions, designation of approved certifying bodies, defined time intervals for certification, and defined personnel actions based on successful or unsuccessful certification. So we were grateful for that comment. Are there any questions? If I move, we vote? Oh, sure.
On the very last paragraph, on the last page, it says, many certification bodies rely on unpaid volunteers, but requiring compliance with ISO 17024 may require these bodies to hire staff for administration and quality control. Why is that in here?
That was a comment that was actually made by an individual on the subcommittee who seemed to feel that the greater majority of certification bodies, for example, ABC, has a large contingency of volunteers. And they just felt that for consistency and purpose, that if there were more paid staff, that they would be able to march to accreditation in a more uniform way.
But does it really matter if an all-volunteer organization can do it by themselves?
No, but I think that that's automatic, that includes that. This was...
I just don't know why it's included if it's not a requirement.
Well, we were responding to the overall comment that was made by a subcommittee member who felt very strongly about this.
Because I'm a board of director for a certifying body for IASIS, and we are completely volunteer, and we are accredited through FSAB with no paid staff. But this seems to make it look like we're not capable of doing it without having paid staff.
Oh, that certainly wasn't the intent. It was, and this doesn't say should have or may or, it just simply says that there would be most likely, I'm thinking administrative staff more than anything. You find this insulting?
Well, I just don't know the purpose of it.
Right there, may require?
Yeah, is that?
What I have highlighted, is that
I
the
think-
issue?
Troy, I think that this was kind of, it followed on from the paragraph before that the commission acknowledges that there will be challenges for requiring forensic science certifying bodies to attain the accreditation. I certainly don't think that this means that you will have to hire someone else, but there may be some certifying bodies that, because of staffing limitations from their volunteers, may have to. I think it's just a acknowledgement of a challenge that could be real for some bodies.
Do you think this would be better in Appendix D as a potential concern and not in the body of the document?
I don't know that it's needed at all. If you read the stricken last paragraph, it was even more critical. An accredited forensic science certification body consisting of paid staff assures. No, it doesn't.
That's why we got rid of it.
Well, I still think the sentence above it has nothing to do with whether it's a good certifying body. If you can meet it with all volunteers, great.
Okay.
I think that I read the tenor of this the way I've read the tenor of actually all of the documents that have been produced by this subcommittee, which is that in each of them we recognize the challenges that are involved and that there are resources involved. And I think that it would be fair to say that the community that has commented to us has been very concerned about that, and that we want to make clear that we understand that in some instances this may cost more, it may require more resources than currently, and to not acknowledge that was insulting to the community. And so I think both here, where we say just may require, and where else what we're gesturing to is that this takes resources. Doing it right takes more resources. Whether it's more time of your volunteer staff, or whether it is that you have to hire staff or bring in more volunteers, but it would be a disservice. The tenor of the comments that we've gotten is that we need to acknowledge that we understand that, and we're still calling for this.
Yeah, I mean, I volunteer on a certification board as well, and I didn't take it the way that you did, but.
Judge Hervey?
I didn't take it that way either, but you could, if you added, would it help if you added may require these bodies to additionally hire? Because, you know, I don't know if that makes a difference or not, but then you've got volunteers in. If you need it, you can have paid staff. But I didn't see it as hitting the volunteers.
I don't think it's that negative.
Frankly, I think that Cecilia put her finger right on it. Where this belongs is in Appendix D at the end, because it is an additional consideration for implementation. There may be some bodies may be able to go ahead and do it without paid staff, and some may find it necessary to hire staff.
Jeff? Or no? Suzanne?
So Troy, just a question. I'm wondering for IASIS, as a result of this views document, if your demand became an order of magnitude greater, would you want that sentence in there to help you advocate with your body or to NIJ that you needed a paid assistant?
No, I don't think having it in this document is going to help us purchase or hire somebody. We'll do that whether we need to or not. It comes down to whether we can fulfill the requests that our customers have. my concern was the previous sentence that got stricken out, saying that it ensures that this is a good, that paid staff ensures compliance. It doesn't. And I still think that that is, even while it was even stricken from the previous document, I can live with it being in the appendix. I just don't think it belongs in the body of the document itself.
Could you fix it by just saying skip the first introductory statement and just say requiring compliance with may incur additional costs on behalf of the certification body, and not, so that has no qualitative.
We did that in
implication.
Appendix D, actually. We added, if you, let me see if I can go down. It said, we added another bullet, budgetary constraints may impact the ability to obtain and maintain certification. But that was more of a process for an individual, taking care of your staff.
All right.
So can we just move the
I-
the thing?
I'm fine just moving that sentence to Appendix D if that will satisfy.
And then we'll not change the document because we're just moving it to one location.
So I move that we vote on that amendment?
The last sentence in the background?
Yeah, it's on page 44, I believe. Okay, oh, yeah.
No, this is the wrong document.
Yeah.
You need to go to the document for the bodies, not the
Yeah, you're on this.
FSSPs. Sorry. Yes. Oh, well. Yes.
That's it.
That last mini cert, yeah.
Point of order, do we even need to take a vote if the friendly amendment is accepted?
We accept it.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're just moving it from one page to another.
Okay, thank you, Troy.
So it's been changed in the document to,
Okay.
we just said.
Right. Right, and that wasn't in the official views part anyway, it was in the background. That just went from background to appendix.
Yeah.
Are there any other?
Two more, this one and the next one.
No, yep.
Yep, ready to vote. We're still only getting 31, so someone's clicker's slow or something, I don't know. Okay, 97% yes, 3% no, so it passes. Okay. Next document.
The next document is the views of the Commission for the Certification of Forensic Science Practitioners. And you may find that, the track changes on page 68. We had 9 comments, and they were all excellent. They were, again, very well thought out. Please note that the appendices essentially are the same, so whatever was changed in the appendices in the accreditation of certification bodies were also changed here. And so all updates have been made. One of the concerns of several individuals that commented, including the ASCLD board, was the first bullet. And they seemed to feel that we were giving them, giving people a loophole about specific individuals. So we changed that, the wording around, and it now reads, review available certification programs. Now, this is the forensic science service provider, giving preference to certification bodies accredited to ISO IEC 17024 or to those in the process of obtaining accreditation, and apply certification requirements to job descriptions for specific positions, including but not limited to managers, analysts, and technical support for those positions in which certification programs do not exist. Review of a state or local agency certification program should be considered. There was also a recommendation that Appendix D, the one that we just discussed, be also in this document, and so we transferred that as well. So we're going to have to transfer that. No, we don't, because that's about accreditation bodies. So that Appendix D is fine. I think I'm talking to myself. Okay, there was also a concern about entry-level examiners having to have certification if they haven't done independent casework, and we feel that that first bullet makes the forensic science service provider responsible for making sure that the individuals are not programmed for failure simply because they don't have experience. And again, there was a concern about budgetary constraints, so we did add that to Appendix D as well. There was an individual comment about timeframes and once they're hired, and how do we make sure that that works, and what happens if they don't pass the test. Again, that's reiterated in that first bullet, that the forensic science service provider should be responsible for that. But we did add the sentence, certification of forensic science practitioners. There's a...
What page?
It's the appendix for certification of forensic science practitioners. And Appendix D says the commission acknowledges there will be challenges for agencies requiring certification. And then we, of course, listed all of those. There was a comment specifically from another individual saying that there are individuals who have a comprehensive or general criminalistics certification, and that was not included in Appendix A. And we thought that was very important, so we added that as well. There was another comment about, they said that we shouldn't be, forensic science practitioners should not be forced regarding personal certification. It's not necessary, as forensic science is different than other occupations because the work is scrutinized in court. We disagreed with that statement and said that just because forensic analysis ends up in court, it does not mean that certification is not necessary, and we actually didn't see the link in that. There was another individual comment that said that we should require certification as a condition of testifying at trial. We felt that the scope of this view document is specific for the practitioner, and the forensic science service provider is responsible for implementing and maintaining staff certification, so we did not add that. There were several comments, again, about Appendix A. Another individual said that we should add the word inspection to the list of tasks for the footnote regarding the definition of forensic science service practitioner. And they provided rationale, but we cited that we had already voted on that specific terminology, and that we could not change that. Ted gave some excellent ideas with regards to the clarity of some sentences, as well as some grammatical errors, and we corrected those. I did want to mention that he specifically wanted to know about who's making something mandatory, and that there was a concern, and we again feel that view bullet number 1 takes care of that, and we did add the sentence requiring forensic science service providers to mandate the certification of their forensic science practitioners, etc. And that was on the last page. And then we made the other changes that he wanted. So there were 9 comments on that. Are there any questions?
is just a question about a typo. In the copy I have under overview, is the second sentence supposed to be providers instead of practitioners? You're talking about accreditation
Certification?
there.
Well,
It-
this is actually divided into two. The first view is for the forensic science service provider. They're the ones that are going to design and develop the program.
Part I'm talking about, it says complements the accreditation of forensic science practitioners who don't get accredited.
Oh, gotcha. Thank
to be
you.
providers. That's
Oh,
second.
wait a minute, wait a minute.
Second sentence under overview.
Wait a minute.
Right. Should be providers there.
Yes, thank you. Troy?
I asked this question when we had our subcommittee meeting on the phone, and I would just like it on the record and answer if we can. I support the certification document as it's written. I'm just curious why the NAS report says that accreditation and certification should both be implemented to enhance forensic science. Yet we make this a views document instead of a recommendation. But we make a recommendation on accreditation. And I would like an answer for the community, the forensic science community, as to why we're going with views on this, but a standard or a mandate, a recommendation on accreditation.
Linda, you had originally answered that question during the subcommittee.
Well, so, again, directive recommendations versus views documents are also based upon what can actually be achieved. Accreditation is something that can be directed and mandated within DOJ by the Attorney General. Certification, because of some of the complexities that we've listed out in the documents about position descriptions, union requirements, I mean, a variety of other issues, it's more complex than you can just say, just become certified. So, and especially in the federal government, which the Attorney General, if we made a directive recommendation, would have control over, that wouldn't happen. And so we made it a views document because that's as strong as we can make it at this point. Right?
My concern is that we're putting time frames that you should be, I think the recommendation said you must be certified within 5 years, but there's no enforcement mechanism behind this. It's the view that we should all be certified within 5 years from implementation of this document. If it's a views document, shouldn't the view be that everybody should get accredited or should get certified and not start putting timelines as to how fast they should get certified? And the second thing is, I'm sorry for the federal government having problems with implementing certification on their people, but you're forcing or trying to force accreditation on all the state and locals. And I think you should make them the same. If they're make them both views or make them both require recommendations from the Attorney General. She can still mandate certification of her people.
Sure, I was just going to see if somebody from that's within the federal government wanted to speak to that at all.
She can,
Understands the,
well, she certainly can tell us, but all our personnel management, it's controlled through OPM, the Office of Personnel Management. And we actually tried this to do certification, all forensic science examiners, and it has to be something that anyone with a GS 1320, for example, for chemist, it's across government. Can it be done? I assume if there's enough effort that OPM could do something like that, but it was very difficult to implement, I will tell you that. It was just I didn't have an opinion on this either way, so.
Well, it's also difficult to mandate accreditation on all the one-man shops that are all across the country at state and local levels too, but we're doing that.
Yeah, like I said.
Julia?
So our recommendation actually didn't mandate, I think, that what our view is that all places should get accredited. But our mandate, our recommendation to the Attorney General only deals with her shop. And I also think the sort of history of how we've worked is incremental. It's how we work together to get agreement that certification is a good thing, and then we do a deeper dive to figure out, okay, what is it the Attorney General could do within her purview to make this happen? And so your suggestion, I think, is part of the unfinished business. If we could do it all at once, it'd be too big a document. So I think it's part of a process that Pam's going to elucidate as she goes through and shows each stage that the documents have taken. But we actually started with a views document on accreditation, and then we went to a recommendation that was specific to what the Attorney General could accomplish. And likewise, we've done views documents on documentation, and now we've gotten more specific. And I think that this just goes to the unfinished business that still needs to be done, which is to figure out what it is the Attorney General could do to implement this within DOJ.
Thank you, Julia. Dean?
Dean?
I have two, well, one comment and one question. The first question really is, bullet number 1 is in italics, and I didn't know if there was a reason why that was there in emphasis, or was that just a grammatical or editing carryover?
It was italicized in the adjudication comments, and
Okay.
it was a cut and
That's
paste.
fine. I didn't know if there was significance.
No,
That's
that's a
why I
good
was
point.
asking. Like, hey, do this one
It is-
first, or
it's-
this is really important.
No, I appreciate that.
And on the third bullet, which is the top of the next page of that document, it says include certification requirements and position descriptions where possible. It's a philosophical thing with me. I fully support this. I've certified myself. I've been certified for 21 years since, the program even came out, so I have no issue with the concept. However, putting my crime lab management hat on to force, in quotes, certification onto entities creates a huge burden when it comes to personnel issues, pay scale issues, union issues. And when it says include certification requirements, I'm wondering if maybe better language might be to say encourage, comma, and include where possible certification requirements. Because I think the idea is, if the views is we want the view that everyone wants to pursue this, but I just don't know, because I wasn't part of your subcommittee, why you would just say include certification requirements. I'm just really concerned about the burden it places on laboratories in some areas where they have no control over the ability to provide a pay scale structure, which is typically tied to certification.
I think, Dean, that this was included in here because of the success in our lab, maybe. When the NAS document came out, we had 16% of our laboratory certified, and we're now almost at 90. But we made a concerted effort. We knew it was going to take about 5 years. We had to get together with the union. We had to get together with the people who had been there a long time. The only way that we could make this work is to make sure that in the job description from this point on, that there was awareness there. But there are time limits that are given, or time increments that are given, and experientials that are given, and all this other stuff. So I think to say that we would encourage it, I think that takes away from what we're trying to do. If you're going to say that it's important that everyone be certified, they need to know coming in that that's how you feel, or that's what the mandate is. And not how you feel, but that's what the mandate is. So that's why it just says you should include this in your job description. And I will say that there were issues with people saying that's not in my job description, and that's part of the 10%. So this is here on in. So I actually feel kind of strongly about making this a stronger statement.
So you can have until 4:30. We just checked with Jeff and Suzanne. So we have, in order to finish the vote on this and then introduce your other document.
Okay,
So.
thank you. Okay, were there other, I'm not sure we agreed on any changes other than de-italicizing that first bullet and changing practitioners to providers. Okay. So I guess we are ready for a vote if there are no more discussions. So moved. Second. Thank you. I was like, so moved, second.
have 94% yes, 3% no, 3% abstain, so it passes. And we had 31 votes, so I have to track down who the missing vote is from, but we'll do that. Thank you.
All right, so our last thing that we wanted to talk about was, as you remember, we had, after the attorney, or Deputy Attorney General had come back with the specification that that DOJ would be moving forward with implementing universal accreditation, but that she requested us to go back and look at how that would really best apply to digital evidence, because A, they were not part of the original charter, and that community had not had an opportunity to comment on the document when it was out the first time. And so what we had done in order to try and elicit the most comments possible was we pretty much took the original universal accreditation document, made a few changes to make it applicable to digital evidence, and put that out for public comment to elicit those comments. And at the same time, we put together a digital evidence subject matter expert panel that could assist us with really educating us about some of the differences between where that digital evidence discipline is, not only with accreditation in mind, but also just where they are in the investigation process versus the evidence in court process. It's just, you know, there was a lot more to learn about that. And with that original document, we had received, I think it was 77 comments, quite a lot of comments, with some very strong feelings in those comments. And we appreciated that. We were able to use those comments as well as all the great information that the subject matter experts, some of which spoke to this commission at the last meeting in the panel. And so from that, we basically rewrote the document, taking into account a lot of that information, and that is what is currently out for public comment now. So we did not adjudicate every single comment that came in, because really we feel like we addressed a lot of the comments by just completely rewriting the document. But we did send out an adjudication document. But really what we tried to do was first frame the issue with the importance of accreditation, that we as the commission feel that accreditation is important, but kind of recognize some of the things that were brought out with some of the comments. Things, you know, it became very apparent that the digital evidence community didn't really have a good understanding of how accreditation would fit in their operation, and what the benefits would be and what the difficulties would be, and understanding what the pros and cons and how that would happen. And so we thought that it was important that we asked in our recommendations to the Attorney General to be a leader for some of those things, with selecting the right kind of accreditation standard. There's been a lot of talk from the digital evidence folks about how the ISO standard 17025, which is for testing laboratories, may not be the best standard to use, although it certainly can be used and has been used by certain laboratories already, including mine and Patricia's. But that there may be another standard that would be more applicable, and we think that should be looked into, especially for some of the folks that are doing digital evidence in their organization, and they don't have any other forensic science disciplines, so they don't have any of the experience with the kind of quality system that is required to be put together for one of the ISO standards. So anyway, we changed our recommendation. So our first recommendation is that the digital multimedia forensic science service providers in DOJ that are already accredited, they should maintain their accreditation. And that secondly, the Attorney General should direct other DOJ digital multimedia forensic science service providers to implement the critical steps to accreditation as best practices until accreditation can be achieved. And because we were trying to preemptively follow the new SPO rule of not just tagging another document in the recommendation, Jonathan helped us write the sentence that just basically, very briefly encapsulated what those critical steps are. But they are, gone through more specifically in that critical steps document. And that the Attorney General should require that federal prosecutors, where practicable in cases where they are in a position to request forensic testing, contract with accredited digital and multimedia evidence FSSPs, and obviously this would not apply to analysis that were conducted prior to the involvement of a federal prosecutor. This particular bullet, we've actually already, in the public comment that is open now, we've already received 10 comments, and that's one of the areas that has received a fair number of those comments, partially because it seems that there are a lot of task groups and multi-jurisdictional type task forces that work where state and locals and federal folks work together on different things, and so that could cause a little bit of confusion with who was doing what. And then the Attorney General should appoint a group to determine the best standards and supplemental requirements for accreditation, especially for those that are not affiliated with a provider location with existing accredited services. And that the Attorney General should provide education to the community on accreditation, the applicability, the requirements, and the benefits for the digital evidence discipline. And part of that is also looking across the areas and really determining what in there should be subject to accreditation and what should not. The tools that are given to an officer on the street to be able to take evidence and submit it into the laboratory, they're using a tool that's been provided and it's probably been evaluated by someone. That person, is probably not necessarily part of the accredited part, versus the people who are doing the more complex evaluations, not on the street. And that the Attorney General should encourage, by all means possible, the path to accreditation for all digital multimedia FSSPs using any available mechanisms. So that's just a added bullet of encouragement. So that's kind of the summary, and then we'll take the rest of our 4 minutes for discussion. Troy.
Since this has to do with my field.
Yes.
One of the things that I was concerned about was the first bullet there. If you can scroll down just a little bit, it says that the feds should be accredited to 17025, yet our fourth bullet says that we need to have the Attorney General get a group together to find out what is the best standard to accredit to. Shouldn't those be reversed?
It actually does say 1705 or 17020, and those are two different standards that you could choose from.
But if number 4 says, let's get a group together that can determine what is the best standard, shouldn't we do that first before we mandate you use one of these two standards?
Right, so that's following upon where they're to maintain the accreditation that has already been achieved under 17025?
Or prepare for.
Or prepare for.
Right.
So there's already been a precedent set that 17025 has been achieved by DOJ labs, and they should maintain that, and it was under 170. Now, we've already talked about that there are other entities, and that we recognize they may have different challenges, and so that's where the fourth bullet is. There's no reason to say all of those that currently are under 17025 should give it up, because they've demonstrated that it does work and it can work for them, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't further explore what's coming out or what may come out in the future.
The other question I had about bullet 4 when we're saying that the Attorney General should get a group together, shouldn't that be organizations like SWIG-DE or the OSAC who already have those people in place? Why don't we just recommend that she use those?
What, Matt, is Matt still on?
Well, I think that the OSAC's not looking at accreditation standards, but, I mean, she could do whatever she wants to task it. That might be one recommendation of how to do it, but we're not dictating that. We're just simply saying, you pick. But
Well, but it's our recommendation, so why don't we recommend that they use Scientific Working Group on Digital Evidence, who also have multiple members on OSAC?
Well, we'll look at that. Matt?
Troy, was this the particular document that you felt the Attorney General was being told to order non-federal employees to follow?
I think the very last bullet, the Attorney General should encourage, by all means possible, the path to accreditation, utilizing any available mechanism, means we're going to withhold funding if you don't get accredited. Yes.
Because the first two bullet points are obviously just addressed to DOJ digital evidence people, and she can certainly do that. The last four are all things that have to do potentially with non-DOJ employees, but I would suggest she has the authority to do each of those as well. For instance, she can instruct U.S. attorneys' offices to prefer accredited shops over non-accredited shops. She can ask for people within the department to formulate a group and determine the best standards and supplemental requirements, recognizing that while DOJ may have done some things in the past, there may be better ways of accomplishing more bang for our buck in the future. She can provide from her bully pulpit recommendations to the community about accreditation and its benefits. And that leaves the last bullet point being the funding mechanism, which certainly the Department of Justice has, Jerry can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the Department of Justice can kind of identify what the requirements are to apply for grant funding and other forms of federal funding through DOJ and BJA, NIJ, all those J's.
No requirements at this time.
My concern was that this will make a requirement that if you want future training or you want money for your forensic unit or forensic lab, because we have a lot of task forces, Internet Crimes Against Children task forces with a lot of state and locals, that they wouldn't get training if it wasn't for this type of funding. They aren't going to be able to get accredited in all reality. And this just seems like a threat. I would be perfectly happy if it said the Attorney General should encourage the path to accreditation for all FSSPs. But when you start throwing in utilizing any available mechanism, and by any and all means possible, that's where the threat comes in.
Would you have any objection to it if it included and the exercise of good judgment? Okay.
But Troy, you need to keep in mind though that when you do a recommendation like that, we'll be gathered here in 20 years and there'll be a whole bunch of people that haven't done that. I mean, that's the whole point of this, is to put the hammer down gently and say, this is what's coming up, get yourself prepared and get ready to go. I mean, that's, you know, there are a lot of carrots to this as well too. I mean, we have grant funding that's available for this sort of thing, but you can't just sort of sit around and say, you know, we really encourage it. I mean, there's no enforcement mechanism, so one way to help enforce that is to make the grant funding in the future a carrot.
Then why don't you put that on there? We're going to withhold your grant funding. Why just say any means possible?
What if they were to give you, what if they were to provide additional funds to you to facilitate that?
Oh, I think a lot of labs are going to need funding if they're going to be mandated to have accreditation, absolutely.
Sure. And that's kind of been the experience in some other disciplines as well, where there have been, the funds have been made available to help facilitate that. Would that be a good thing?
Oh, I think funding is always a good thing for state and locals.
Okay.
Okay, may I just interject here? You're going to meet as a subcommittee, correct, between now and January?
Yes, so this is
And you
out
have,
for public
okay,
comment
there's 15
again?
more days for public comment on this document, so there'll be a chance for the subcommittee to work on it further, and then you'll be discussing it in, hopefully its final form, in some format and adjudication at the next meeting in January, right?
That is correct, and so please, if you have, I know our time is up, so anybody that has any more comments, if you could please forward them to us so that we can consider those as we do that, that would be awesome.
But I do think it's important for the commissioners to know what's been happening in the subcommittee. I mean, this generated a huge number of public comments, some thoughtful, and some, frankly, just nasty. Taking a look at it gives you a tenor of what the community thinks about being communicated with, about what sort of standards might be appropriate and what sort of quality management systems might be appropriate. And this document, I think, was yeoman's work principally by our co-chairs. It's a real step back from what we said earlier about accreditation. And I think it's sort of faced up to political reality, that this is a community that's going to have to be brought along. But I think Jerry makes a good point. And yes, part of the point is, all right, calm down, everyone. But this is coming. Quality management matters. And so I think it's important as commissioners to recognize that we stepped back from that earlier document, not because we collectively, I think some of us individually, but not because we collectively think that there's some big hurdle to getting these folks to be accredited, but because of such the vociferous response and trying to find a way to bring this conversation forward. And I just think that's important for the commissioners to appreciate when we ultimately get to what this final document looks like and voting on it. Thank you.
Thanks. So you'll have 15 more days for public comment on that, and then the subcommittee will meet and address those, and we'll discuss it next meeting. Scientific inquiry and research.
Thank you. Good afternoon. We received 2 comments on this document, one from Ted and one that really wasn't a comment on the document, so we didn't address it. And if you want to look at it, you may, but we just felt that it wasn't a comment on the document. So we spent, I think a lot of the debate on this really happened when we were talking about the views document, which has already been passed. And so this was to specify recommendations and to answer this is on page 95 of your binder, and then the adjudication of public comments. And essentially, we made no changes, but we tried to make it clear why we didn't make changes. So philosophically, we wanted to make the point to NIST that we really, as a body, want to have the underlying science validated or examined or tested or evaluated, but we didn't want to we could easily go down the road where we spent all our time trying to define test method, and so forth. And those terms, I think, vary from discipline to discipline, and that was generally our consensus, because what a test method to a chemist might be different than a test method to somebody doing trace evidence. So we tried to construct the document such that the intent was clear. We would like NIST to evaluate, to look at, to examine this and we didn't want to put artificial constraints on them. So that's why we stuck with the definitions and explanations that we had for these. And we also, I think, as we saw at noon, hopefully, I think our trust was well placed, because these folks have been doing this for a very long time and have developed what we think, I mean, from all, looks like very reasonable approach and in genuine, in what we had in mind. And we also recognize that there's two mechanisms by which this can be addressed. One would be a NIST review of the core science as they see it, and they can define that. And then the other avenue is the OSAC and the technical merit review. And the technical merit review, again, we discussed this one quite a bit because there was a number of suggestions about how to beef up the technical merit review, make it the primary method of doing this or not. And we came to the consensus that, A, the OSAC process is still evolving. As we heard this afternoon, that technical merit is changing and evolving, and clearly that there is being a response to that. So we're comfortable with having both of those avenues available and both of those being under the purview of NIST and the group in charge of that. And then finally, the comment, Ted had made one comment about our charter doesn't really let us talk to NIST. Well, that's true, but we're going to do it anyway. And we are, and clearly that the sense of this document has been translated. So we made no changes to the document that was put out, but we did list the adjudication in some detail if you wish to read it. But there's not a red line document here because we left it as it was. So it stands, it's ready for a vote after discussion, and I think all of this was probably the most interesting and involved debate that we had as a subcommittee, and I think most of us share the feeling that this is probably the most important thing that we have as a subcommittee done. And we understand that it's different than the forensic community has done in the past, but I think the feeling is very strongly that this needs to be done, and we feel like the avenue that's been laid out and the people that we've entrusted to do it are capable of doing it. So with that, if there are questions or anything that we can clarify for you. Yeah, Ted.
I wanted to follow up on my question earlier to Dr. Kavanaugh. He seemed to indicate that what NIST is intending to do is more of a foundational disciplinary review. When I look at this document, what it seems to me to be asking for is a document-by-document assessment of the OSAC candidate standards that are coming out. For example, recommendation number 3 requests that the Standards Board should commit to placing consensus documentary standards on the OSAC registry of approved standards for only those forensic science test methods and practices where technical merit has been established by NIST. And you go back to footnotes 3 and 4, these are clearly specific individual documents. You're defining a test method and a practice as defined by ASTM. Test method is a definitive procedure that produces a test result, and a practice is a definitive set of instructions performing one or more specific operations that does not produce a test result. So these are discrete documents, and it seems to be, correct me if I'm wrong, this recommendation seems to be at odds with what Dr. Kavanaugh said NIST is going to do.
Well, we respectfully disagree on that because the test methods, for example, I mean, there's a difference between the underlying science and a test method in our mind in that if you look at DNA, you're talking about capillary electrophoresis, you're talking about PCR. If you talk about how it's applied, that's a standards document, and that's where technical merit will be established either by NIST or by the technical merit review document that's prepared. So they're really, I think, and correct me subcommittee if you disagree, but our sense was that, for example, there are some things that the underlying science and foundations of, like analytical chemistry, are in a different state than, say, for a pattern evidence. And so we would want, and certainly the 3 that were listed seem to make perfect sense to me, but we envisioned, and in our opinion, the document is clear that NIST is going to do 2 things. They're going to do what Dr. Kavanaugh described this morning in general, and then they also, within the OSACs, beef up the technical merit, where they're doing literature reviews and things that we have talked about as a subcommittee before. So it's not an either or, it's a partnership but we're speaking very clearly to NIST and the OSAC structure here. So and the documents are there for reference, they're to help it out, but we just did not want to get trapped, and I use that word on purpose, in trying to define every term to the point that NIST has no flexibility in using scientific judgment. So
I just wanted to make sure that this is specifically requesting that each candidate documentary standard produced by NIST, that's a test method, as that term is described in ASTM, and actually OSAC has its own definition of test method. You're requesting that NIST evaluate each one of those documents before the board commits to putting them on the registry. Is that the request?
no, that's not the request. The request is that NIST evaluate the foundational science where required, and that the OSAC take the technical merit must be more rigorous than it has been in the past.
Okay, well, that's not what number 3 says from my perspective, because when you're footnoting in 3 and 4 the definitions of test method and practice, those are documents. And you're saying that in number 3, these documents should be assessed by NIST, for better or for worse. I don't even address that. The point is, it seems to me clear that, and in recommendation number 1, and this is also somewhat based on my involvement in OSAC and the LRC, there are certain members who believe strongly that each discrete candidate test method produced for potential enrollment in the registry go to NIST and be evaluated before it's put on that registry, and you're telling me that's not what you're asking NIST to do?
No.
Okay.
And I don't, from the OSAC, I'm on a subcommittee, and I would never have interpreted it that way either.
Then why is 3 and 4 footnoted? Because that gives meaning to test method and practice. Those are documents.
Well,
those aren't the underlying foundation of the discipline. Those are
well,
documents.
Impartially, in response to earlier comments that things were not footnoted to give a reference to. I think that, it's there as an example, this is what it is, but how you apply even those definitions is going to vary from discipline to discipline. If I'm in an OSAC where I'm promulgating a new method for doing drug detection by GCMS, I don't have to go back to the 1800s to tell you about chromatography. And so, that's going to be different discipline to discipline, and I just didn't see, and the subcommittee, correct me if I'm wrong, a way to do that, so we decided to make it general enough and let NIST do what NIST does.
Is that's the consensus of the subcommittee about what that means, that document? It's not meant to say that each OSAC candidate standard test method has to go to an independent body or NIST to be assessed or to be tested to see if it produces accurate results. That's not
the intent.
Okay.
The intent is for technical merit to evaluate that.
And that's going to be done how exactly?
Through the technical merit review process that is in place and evolving at OSAC, as when Jeremy was talking about. Because there has been back and forth on trying to improve that process.
And that doesn't envision a wet lab type evaluation of that method. In other words, let's take this recipe for how to conduct this test and go through it and see if it produces a valid and reliable result.
No, because certainly if a method gets to the point where it's going to be proposed as a standard, it has to be validated in the literature, it has to be peer reviewed. So that we're not asking another entity to say, make sure. The scientific back and forth should have done it, or technical merits would say, nope, you're not ready to go.
Okay. So Ted, though, in fairness, I think it does, at some level, require wet chemistry. It just it should have already been done. You would
Okay,
expect
that's my
that
point, I
some-
guess, is I'm trying to figure that out.
So one of your comments, a very good one, of like, what's the difference between a study or a research study? So I think we use the term study to get at somebody somewhere better show that this works. If you say you can detect molecule X with FTIR, somebody somewhere better show that technique actually works for molecule X.
I agree with that. It's just that the different terms seem to be confusing as to who's supposed to be producing these. Are these supposed to be produced by NIST? Are these supposed to already be in existence? And that's why, I was very concerned about how vague, and maybe it was on purpose, the document was written to sort of be available to conform to different interpretations as things develop. But being asked to vote on this is very difficult to know what you're voting for.
Right. So I think it's not meant to be vague, but meant to be flexible. That if NIST ponies up, maybe with these first 3 disciplines, and says, hey, those instruments that you just got a tour of, we'll actually do some of the wet chemistry, great. But I think they've also said, we're not the people to do the wet chemistry on all this. There are lots of invested parties who will probably do these studies. And in the absence of NIST, you know, that there's this, who can evaluate this? Maybe there's an ad hoc technical merit committee. We wanted to give the OSACs the freedom to say, we don't want to stop progress. So we tried to add in as much flexibility as possible, but still, maybe to Jerry's comment, keep a little bit of the teeth of we shouldn't be publishing standards with the implication that they're valid if there's no studies, and nobody's even given, you know, with some review of, does this make sense? Is this the right thing to do? So we're trying to keep those teeth and give as much flexibility as possible.
Okay, Marilyn?
Yes, so I was previously very concerned about progress stopping, and I appreciate greatly the subcommittee's effort, and I'm on that subcommittee, to come up with an alternative so that progress doesn't stop. And so with Ted's talking here, I really do sort of think the technical review by NIST is going to be maybe very much broader in scope and depth, but that the Technical Merit Review Committee that can independently be set up by OSAC will be looking at every standard that comes out. And so they won't be looking maybe at the whole field. They're going to look at each standard, and they give a way for the progress to move forward when, you know, if it had just been NIST, it would be years and years that these standards couldn't get out. So I do think that the committee's done a good job of providing a way to go forward, and I think it will allow OSAC to do its work.
Okay, thank you. Yep.
Who could argue with technical merit evaluation? My question to all the members of the committee, have you thought about a timeline following up on the last comment? And again, I have to come back and comment on my legal inexperience, but does this in some way give too much control and power to NIST and obviate Dalbert and Kumho-Tyre, and take away the court's ability to look at the body of evidence presented to them in a voir dire or admissibility hearing and make its own decision? So I need to hear from attorneys in the room who are on this subcommittee who may have reflected on this. And is this creating an administrative nightmare that will delay some of these areas of forensics getting on this imaginary list for a decade or more? That would be a question in my mind. Not necessarily a concern, but a practical question.
Peter? No, but I need help.
I'm on the committee, so I guess I'm the only non-scientist on the committee. So, I mean, there are several judges here who could answer the question more directly than I can, Fred. But having been in the pit enough and seen enough judges, I think they will view this the same way many viewed the National Academy report or other reports. It's another arrow in their quiver. Judges are certainly free to find something more persuasive or less persuasive, but ultimately judges are the gatekeepers. And this doesn't in any way deprive them of that role. It just gives them the opportunity to make better informed decisions, and isn't that a good thing?
Jerry?
I just want to say, I mean, I think Ted's bringing up a really good point, because, I mean, as I read this, we're saying that the required studies should be independently evaluated and accepted prior to the creation of any documentary standards involving test methods and practices. We go on to define what a test method is, which is a procedure that produces a test result. To me, this does, and I'm listening to what Ted says, and I agree with him that to me, I'm reading this as any test method. So if I'm doing drug analysis and I do TLC, GCMS, FTIR, and HPLC, it sounds like TLC in and of itself for cocaine is one method. TLC for heroin is another method. TLC for methamphetamine is a third method. I mean, that's what this sounds like to me, the way we've worded it here. And I admit, I mean, I voted to push this through, but Ted's he's messing with my mind right now, because as I read this more, I'm getting more confused as I read this
Jerry,
down.
I think though a method in this way is, it's as declared by your laboratory, right? So if you say at our laboratory, we think we're going to use TLC and Raman to look at methamphetamine, then I think it's fair for me to say, and your sensitivity when you do that is what? And your specificity when you do that is what? And if you go, I don't know, but TLC and Raman work on other molecules, then I go, yeah, we're not putting that on the OSAC registry. You got to at least show that that is capable of detecting this molecule. You got to understand when you can't detect that molecule. So I think it's what you're declaring the method is. It might be a host of these four instruments together is how I identify this molecule.
I don't know, Jeff. I mean, I was a drug chemist for many years, and to me, TLC for cocaine is one method. And then when I have the option of using other types of methods or instruments,
So Jerry, I think though if you declare that it is, I think if you say at my laboratory I'm going to use TLC to identify cocaine, then that's your method, and then you buy the error rates, you buy the sensitivity and specificity that go with TLC. If you say at my lab I use TLC and FTIR, then that's your method, and you've got a more accurate rate.
No, I agree with you, Jeff. What I'm saying is, you use a color test, TLC, and GCMS. That's how you end up, calling cocaine cocaine, by doing all three of those. What I'm saying is, when you do one of those, that's just one method. You combine three methods typically to make an identification of a substance. So that's what I'm saying here. I'm not disagreeing with you.
Well, then you see exactly why we didn't want to go down the rabbit hole. Because DNA, what's the method for DNA? Well, is it PCR? Is it capillary electrophoresis with fluorescent labeling? I mean, it's self-defined. And Arturo, yeah, please.
So I mean, I think we're getting here too much into the weeds and missing the big picture. I think HPLC has been, the science has worked out since the 50s. The method for cocaine, the method for heroin, those are different methods. But I don't think the issue of HPLC as a science is up for debate. I think we're talking about, for example, let's say that somebody decides that they're going to use a microbial signature. We're all sitting in this room. We all live in microbial signatures on this table. Let's say that we want to establish that we were here based on it. To me, that is something that it will require a lot more science before you take this and you begin associating me with sitting on this table. And I think the way that it's written is quite flexible, and I would say, I would make the argument to leave it alone. That the people who are going to be reading this are not stupid. That they're going to read it, and they're going to basically make these value judgments depending on what it is. We cannot come up with a wording that will take care of all circumstances. But the intent here, the big picture, is for have an additional review of the science. And I don't think anyone really here would be opposed to that, especially if you think of a microbial forensic study on that. I don't think we're talking HPLC. We're talking about things that will come in the future and things that are already on the radar screen.
Thank you. Greg?
Yeah, I think, Jeff, the thing that we're getting confused, a lot of people think a method is one type of analysis, where a scheme of analysis may include multiple methods in that, and I think that's what's causing some confusion in this.
Cecilia?
I rarely have heartburn, but I did, on this subcommittee, I had a lot of heartburn with recommendation number 3. And we talked long and hard about it, because I felt the way that, well, it's being described here, that a method that gives the result is included in here. However, I also did not feel that NIST necessarily could shoulder the burden of all the, of providing technical merit for every standard that comes out, and that there needed to be a conduit, and the most appropriate conduit would be the OSACs, and the OSACs clearly have stepped up to that plate. They clearly want to have an advisory board and a commission to help with this. And I think what's even more clear is that they're not going to push forward a standard now knowing that technical merit is going to be the foundation of their standard. And that's what I think this says. And I'm really bad at multiple choice tests because you can convince me of all the answers. I'm one of those kind of test takers. But I want this to be right. And I think it is. I think it, when last in June, when there was an agreement to change recommendation 3 so that the OSACs clearly didn't have a bottleneck going on for a lot of these methods that are clearly foundational and have technical merit. It didn't have to go up to NIST. I think that wasn't just a compromise, it was essential.
Marilyn?
So I think recommendation 3 is absolutely clear. So it's very specific about that for those forensic science test methods and practices where technical merit is established by NIST or in the interim an independent scientific body. So I mean, I think number 3 is really clear. Every guideline that is going to be proposed to go forward is going to have to meet this technical body. So I actually think 3 is really clear now. I understand, in 1 and 2, it gets a little muddier because now we say tests, methods, and practices. And we know that NIST is going to be addressing really the foundational and even standards that get passed through in number 3 by the technical merit of OSAC. Eventually, we hope that NIST will get to do the review of every discipline, okay? And changes may have to occur based on that. So I don't know, I've asked my good friend next to me, can we come up with just some wording that makes it a little clearer? Because 3 is, but is there something about the wording of test methods and practices that maybe doesn't cover exactly, because there's no way NIST can look at every single method. I mean, there's not one method for doing GCMS of any drug. Every lab that establishes, it's just like, the FDA now is saying anything that's established in any lab is going to have FDA review. There is no way they have the capacity to do that. So is there something that would make people more comfortable by a simple word change in 1 or 2 that would better describe what NIST is going to do? Because they're not going to review every test method.
We don't have Jules here right now to try to fix
Well, I
something,
think
right?
it seems like 2 was already taken into consideration at the presentation at lunch. I mean, that was pretty much point by point. How about in 1, we just say of methods or practices?
Yeah, I agree too. To me, 2 looks okay too.
Okay, so method, I mean, but again, here's what the subcommittee wanted to avoid is we don't want to box NIST in by making this too specific.
It's not
But-
specific at all in 2.
Well, 2 is not, but 1 is, so we could say something like the technical merit of methods and/or practices, which I know is a terrible combination, or practices.
So Greg, to your point, what
Yeah.
if we changed it to the technical merit of analytical schemes used in forensic science disciplines? That would capture that sort of constellation of several methods.
One of the problems is footnotes 3 and 4 lock you into what you're talking about when you say test method and practice throughout the document. That defines what you're talking about. And what that's talking about are ASTM test methods and practices, which are documents that someone produces about a step-by-step process how to produce a test result. So that's what that means because you have it defined in 3 and 4, and it gives meaning to every time you use that word throughout the document, you go back to footnotes 3 and 4. So what you're saying is every single document, because of footnotes 3 and 4, have to be evaluated by NIST. And that's the problem.
I guess I just didn't read it that way. Because if you look at a series of specific steps, okay, that's TLC, that's color test, that's crystal test, that's, and again, that's, if there's some suggestions for wording that we can make in one that are simple or straightforward.
Could we replace test with just analytical? So analytical methods and practices instead of test.
Or methodologies.
I was just going to say, take out test and
Yeah,
just make
test.
it methods and practices.
Or analytical, I think, though.
That would be fine.
If you
Methods
want
and
to stay
practices.
vague, just take out footnotes 3 and 4. Then you can make it mean whatever you want it to mean, if that's the way you want to go. But again, it's remaining very vague as to what you mean by methods, and anybody can read that narrowly or very broadly, depending on how they want to interpret.
Subcommittee members?
I mean, I don't have any problem taking out we added those references
Just because-
only as a compromise in it. But if it's clear that the references are the problem, take them out.
Take them out.
I think we take a friendly amendment just to kill footnote 3 and 4.
And change that to methodology?
Remove test, right, that I have highlighted?
I think we should leave the verbiage exactly how it is, and then just take out footnote 3 and
Okay.
4.
Take out the references.
Remove test.
No,
No.
leave that verbiage, take out the
Delete
footnotes.
footnote 3 and 4.
Okay.
You know, I think it's okay. This is an evolving, this is what a deliberative system is. At some point, we had to put the references in order to get past the discussion. Now we're at a different place and we don't need them. It's all right. It's all right.
Do we have any other? Cecilia, is that still up from last time? Cecilia, is your tent? Okay. Anybody else? Okay. Yeah. Shall we move for a vote? Okay, so now I have just a procedural question. Since we have folks that already submitted votes before that was made, do their vote, what do we do? Because that's kind of that seemed to be a sticking point for some people. Well, maybe we should see how the vote goes, but just, but
This is the National Commission on Forensic Science channeling Phil Pulaski, Vince DeMaio, and John Fudenberg. If you are watching in real time, like a few of you are, they could send me emails if they do
Okay.
decide to change their vote. Otherwise,
We're stuck with the vote they
I think
gave
we're
us,
stuck,
yeah.
yeah, with the votes that
Okay.
were submitted. All right, you want to give them another 30 seconds or 60
Well,
seconds?
we'll put up
or-
the vote, and then, we'll start the polling.
Sounds good.
No, it's good. It's okay.
Okay, we have one more if we can get it. One broken clicker? Could be. Okay. Okay, we have 77% yes, 19% no, 3% abstain, so it passes. So. Okay. Public comments, and then I have a few things to say about the reception.
Okay, do we have any public comments? There were 2 individuals that signed up on online registration who wish to submit public comments. So I believe Lindsay has the microphone to my right. If you could raise your hand if you're in the room and continue to want to submit a comment. All right, seeing no hands, did anybody else from the audience, the public, would like to submit a public comment? We will have an oral public comment session at the end of tomorrow's meeting as well. All right, seeing none. All right, and I just wanted to remind everyone there is a 6:45 shuttle to the hotel. Those, I think it may be picking up where it dropped off, but we'll confirm. You can stop by and ask to confirm.
Okay, so just a few comments then about the reception. So going from now until 6:30, and then people will be able to get to the bus and shuttle. We had 7 tours that people had an opportunity to go on. Everybody just had a chance to go on one, those who did go on tours. So those are listed here. And then there's additional ones that are, the ones in black were not part of the original tour. So there's extra stuff out here that you'll be able to see as well in the reception area, in the cafeteria. There's also the courtyards open, so you can go out into the courtyard, and then you can go down to the NIST Museum and to the Wilmer Souder exhibit, which is right down the hallway, and go out the doors here and go down to the hallway. So I encourage you, spend some time talking to NIST colleagues here and get to learn more, a little bit about NIST. Of course, you can talk to each other, that's good too, but just use this time well to be able to get to learn more about NIST. But thank you all for coming and participating today, and we'll see you back tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. The reason we're starting earlier tomorrow is because there's another big meeting going on here at NIST, and so on cloud computing, and so we're trying to get in here before they get started, and so we won't be interfered with as much, and get out of here before they leave. So, thank you.